I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Becky Bigler, who is the Gender and Feminist Psychology Area Colloquium Speaker for this academic year. Her talk is also co-sponsored by the Combined Program in Education and Psychology, CPEP, and the Center for Human Growth and Development, I always get the letters mixed up, and the Developmental Psychology area. So there's lots of interest in the work that Dr. Bigler does, and we are so happy that Dr. Bigler could be here. Now, last night, there was a public talk, which was actually a full room and lots of good food, and lots of educators and parents in the audience who weren't academics, and it went really well, and we were really excited about that, and some of us have talked about trying to continue that model forward of having some more talks with public engagement because of how well the talk went. Now, Dr. Bigler is a professor of psychology and women's and gender studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her PhD is from Penn State University and undergrad from Oberlin College, which influenced your thinking about research. Dr. Bigler is very highly cited with over 20 papers, having more than 100 citations. Her work is featured nationally in the media, on multiple public radio stations, in Parents Magazine, the New York Times, Newsweek, Good Morning America, and USA Today. And Dr. Bigler's work has been really influential to me. As I said last night, I saw a talk about a decade ago that just was really formational for me. And then I had the fortune of seeing you talk again this summer when we were on a panel together, and it was like equally as amazing. And you think, oh, it's just a one-off, who knows? But so I hope you're going to enjoy the talk. And I also want to say that Dr. Bigler is the first person I know who uses gender-neutral pronouns out of a commitment to sort of reducing unnecessary gendering of the world, and that has been also really formative to my own thinking. So thank you for coming, and let's welcome Dr. Bigler.
Oh, and I didn't put my mic on yet, but I think I probably should, just to make sure everyone can hear, although I tend to be loud. Let's see. All right, is that good? Can you hear okay? All right. I am so delighted to be here, and in part because looking at the audience, what I have out here is a whole bunch of young scholars, and that is so exciting because the joy in my work is influencing the next generation of people who come out to do psychological science. And so I will aim my talk, I hope, to say things that are inspirational to you young people who are going to go out and push the field further in terms of what we understand about gender and how we can eliminate gender stereotyping and prejudice from the world. So super happy to be here. So I'm going to talk about environmental contributions to the formation and change of children's attitudes. But I'm going to start out with just a caveat to say how hard it has been to keep up with the literature and how complex our field is with respect to gender. These are the citations in PsycInfo, the sources across spans of time that you get when you search gender attitudes, gender roles, gender-related behavior, and you can just see in this time span the just explosion of research on these questions, and this is making it really hard for the field. And so part of what I want to say is you scholars have a big job ahead of you for many reasons, but one is to keep on top of what is really exploding numbers of sources of knowledge, really for all of science, but it's been true of gender research as well. So, and this is going to mean I'm not going to know everything. It is getting harder and harder to stay on top of everything. But in addition to that, I'm going to talk first just about some challenges to understanding the role of the environment in shaping gender role behavior. It is actually a very hard area to work in, and one of the reasons is the presence of confounding variables. That gender, of course, when you're trying to understand gender differences, gender differentiation, you have environmental factors, but you also have organismic factors, factors internal to the organism that shape outcomes and behavior, and you are going to have interactions between those two things, adding even more complexity to the system. And furthermore, you are often going to have confounds with the environment itself it's going to make it hard to clearly understand what a particular environment is doing because of all the things going on. And I wanted to start by giving one specific example in a domain that I care about, that I think is important, and which shows the complexity of trying to understand an environmental context and its influence on gender. And that is single-sex schools. So what you have had in recent history is a change in policy in the United States. In 2006, the Department of Ed under the Bush administration made, really for the first time since Title IX in the 1970s, single-sex public schools legal. So it became legal again, they were banned, to make segregation by gender legitimate in public schools, schools that receive federal dollars. And then an important question is, so what are the effects, right? This is an interesting environmental question. If you go to school with only girls and you're a girl, can we see effects on your gender role, attitudes, or behavior? Things like your academic achievement, your stereotypes, your achievement in STEM fields, for example. A very interesting question. But to understand this, you have to deal with the possible potential confounds, right, associated just with the question of being in a single-sex environment. And one of the first ones off the bat is the possibility that there are confounds with the characteristics of individuals who self-select into particular environments. Right? So we have to be sure that the people who go into a single-sex environment versus a co-ed environment aren't different before they ever get there, in order for us to draw any kind of conclusions about what the environment is doing. And I just wanted to walk through some of the complexity of that. So it turns out, when I first got interested in single-sex schooling in Texas, in Austin, the district decided to start public single-sex schools. They have started 3 of them in Austin, just in our school district, in the last 10 years. And I became interested in this question about the possible effects. And one of the first possible confounds that I knew we needed to control for was the possibility that academic achievement predicted who would go into single-sex versus co-ed schools. So right off the bat, if you're going to ask a question like, does single-sex schooling promote girls' achievement in science fields, for example, a major hypothesis, you need to make sure the girls aren't already better at math and science, right, or more motivated in math and science before they get there. So we had the possibility to do some data collection with the first of the single-sex schools called the Ann Richards School for Young Women Leaders, which opened, and which allowed us to collect some data. Now, the Ann Richards School told us, the district, the Austin Independent School District, and the school principal, told us that entrance into the school would be random. There would be a lottery, and girls would be randomly selected. Now, they said there was an application, so girls had to apply, but then there would be a random lottery, and so they said you're going to have to deal with this complexity of there is an application, some girls won't apply and will be at co-ed, and then on top of that, there will be this random lottery to get in. So we started to address this in this first paper having to do with the selection question. So what we did when we started is we had 121 girls who were admitted to the public single-sex school and 229 who were applicants but who were denied. And we were told by the district these 2 groups would be equivalent. Now, one of the things I did in the research I now advocate is I did not really believe the school district. But I'm telling you, many, many researchers in the field do. They said that we were told it was random. I believe them. They don't check for random assignment. They don't check for the presence of confounds. So we filed an open records request through the district and got outcomes. And we got outcomes on the state for girls in the year before they applied. So 5th grade, they haven't ever heard of the school yet, they haven't applied yet, and now we can look at girls who are going to apply, who are not going to apply, but also who are going to get in or not get in 1 year later. And then we can do these comparisons more carefully to check for confound effects. So I want to show you first, here's what we find at the end of 6th grade. So at the end of the first year, they enter in 6th grade. At the end of the year, the district is very pleased with the outcome. The single-sex school, middle school, has very high top scores compared to the co-ed schools. And sure enough, when we look, though, at the girls' performance at the end of the year, the girls who did not get in and are going to go to their co-ed schools are going to underperform. So the middle school girls are going to have higher scores on the standardized test, the 4, 7, 35, than the other girls. So the school looks successful, right? And the school is going to come out and say, we're successful. The girls who get in are better. And we are going then to do that necessary step of checking for the confound. So we're going to look for the girls in 5th grade. We go back to 5th grade, we check for the difference. There is a statistically significant difference in who gets in and who doesn't. Now, a big controversy ensues. We know this, we publish this, right? We write the article that makes the front page of the school newspaper because the school has been lying about the lottery. The school now gets in trouble and admits it's not a lottery. We are skimming off the top students. But I can tell you, my paper on single-sex schooling, and there are 2,000 papers in the literature on single-sex schooling. Mine is the only one I know of that systematically tracked girls, went back and got data from before they entered to check carefully for the presence. And again, I wouldn't have done this. The district said you do not need to do this. This was a lottery. And I had to do it by filing an open records request, right? And they're pissing off the district. And I just wanted to say one more part of this, which was we did go on to, oh, and I don't think I have a slide of it. That's another confound. Go on to look, it does turn out that it is a good school. And in particular, right, the girls who are going to go there are going to do better. And we end up being able to tell, but that is because kids who go to school in the presence of other high-performing kids do better than kids who go to school in the presence of kids who underperform relative to they do. So we get a co-ed magnet school, right? So we get a school that is matched in its selection criteria and its pool, and now when you control for those things, you see that there is no effective school at all, right? So checking through those things was able to tell us that the single-sex schooling itself was not the causal agent in the achievement. And I just wanted to highlight one other possible selection criteria, which is the question of whether the girls who select into the school have the same attitudes about gender than the kids who don't select into the single-sex school in the district. So we also sought to test this hypothesis in another paper in which we were able to look at people's attitudes about single-sex schooling. And specifically, we asked a bunch of questions about why single-sex schools would be effective and necessary. And we had different kinds of statements, including some that were gender essentialist statements. And they included things like, girls need different schools than boys because their brains are different and they learn differently. Right? And then we had some other kinds of statements such as girls just like girls better than boys, and so they like to go to a single-sex school to have more friends than they would at a co-ed school. So we had different kinds of hypotheses, and I just want to highlight the gender essentialist thinking, this idea that girls' brains are different from boys' brains and it influences their thinking and they need their own schools. And when you check and you look at, we looked at parents whose kids attended single-sex schools, parents who attended the co-ed magnet schools in the same district, matched for ethnicity and SES, and you look at the teachers in the single-sex school and the teachers in the co-ed schools, and you look at the children themselves, what you find is, indeed, the groups are different almost immediately after starting the schooling. So here's endorsement of the idea there are gender differences in learning stemming from brain differences inherent to boys and girls. And I've just highlighted the teacher's endorsement of the beliefs. And what you see is the female teachers in single-sex schools. And why that's pulled out is because there are no male teachers at this single-sex school. So we didn't have male teachers to compare. There were male and female at the public co-ed school. they have the highest levels of endorsement of the essentialist beliefs about gender. So the teachers who teach in this school believe that boys and girls, and these teachers, of course, have self-selected into the school. But it is also the case that the students have different views. And this is the funny finding. It is the boys in the co-ed schools who are the lowest in the endorsement of bring differences, right, in gender to the. They are saying, no, the girls pretty much learn like we do. And it is really rare in psychology to find that any group of males goes lower on some index of sexism than females do. So, again, you see the teachers very high, and the girls in the single-sex school, again, scoring higher, statistically significant in endorsing this gender essentialist belief. So in other words, we know we have definitely confounding variables, and we are not studying the pure difference of sitting in a classroom with boys versus sitting in a classroom with girls when we are looking at the question of single-sex schooling. And one last one, and I show this to make a point about sexism, about gender. When girls apply to the single-sex school, they write a letter, an application, a cover letter saying they want to attend the school. They gave us all those application letters. We were able to code them for the content of their reasons for wanting to go. I pulled out some quotes of a common theme. It is the second most common theme in the letters of what most frequently coded reason, and I'll read you some. I would get a better education without bothersome, immature boys making unintelligent remarks, noises, and actions. Because when there are boys, they fool around, and they distract other people, and when there are old girls only, they seem to stay on track most of the time. Boys are a very big distraction and cause problems in our class. The boys are always being distracting and interrupting. I'm not saying boys are cruel, I'm saying boys are distracting. The most frequent reason for saying they wanted to go to a single-sex school is because their parents want them to go there. The second most reason are these characteristics of boys. And what is interesting is most teachers find these remarks very reasonable. They say, look at this, of course, they want to get away from boys. The boys are distracting, they're the behavior problems, they're being disruptive in the classrooms. Imagine white kids said this about reasons for wanting to go to an only white school. The blacks are the behavior problems. The blacks distract me. They cause problems. I'm not saying they're cruel. I'm just saying it's really distracting to have them in the room. We would not find that an acceptable reason. In other words, what you've seen is socially, right, acceptance of this idea that we can stereotype a whole group as the problems in our education system and say that's a legitimate, acceptable reason to want to exclude them from the environment. So you see these differences in the confounds in terms of the background characteristics and views of people who attend the school. So I want to just highlight another big challenge in gender research is the problem of escaping our own cultural lenses. It's like people have said, the fish have trouble perceiving the water when they live in it. We live in a culture filled with gender. I think you have seen in gender research the major role that cultural blinders plays in our kinds of hypotheses about gender across time. There is no reason to believe those same big blinders aren't operating today. We tend to think, oh, sure, in the 1820s we had crazy hypotheses about gender because we were blind, right, to a lot of the cultural practices. But most students now, I find, think, well, we don't have any of those anymore. We see with completely clear eyes what's going on. And yet I would argue that's still not true, and it is very hard to detect some of the common cultural practices that we have lived with. And I just want to give props to one of the most important people in my intellectual history, which is Sandra Bem, who pointed out one of the mechanisms that I think people were blind to when throughout the 80s developmental psychologists have tended to say, of course kids pay attention to gender. It's normal and natural and inevitable that they would pay attention to gender because gender is this big actual category, right? It's a big biological, natural, innate category. Of course people would pay attention to it. And Sandra Bem came along to kind of say, maybe we actually systematically teach it in the culture, right? This idea that it isn't so natural or normal and we don't need to do anything in the culture. And I'm going to return to this theme, but the point is, again, that I think we have blinders that make it hard to detect some things about our environment when we grow up with them. And the last one is the difficulty of performing experimental tests. So the gold standard to identify a causal mechanism is to do a causal test of it, to do experimental manipulation. And people often say to me, that is really hard with biology. Like, why I don't have evidence for why testosterone does something is, oh, it's too hard to do an experiment. I can't do an experiment with any of the biological mechanisms or neurological mechanisms. But the truth is that it is very hard to do this in the environment too. I always say, wait, I have the same problem. I believe that the way women dress in the culture shapes their behavior and attitudes, right? Walking around in shoes like that all day, I argue, does things to women, right, that people who don't walk around in those shoes. So can I randomly assign some boys to wear these shoes for a few years and see what happens? No. So I have the same kinds of constraints on my ability to do experimental manipulations that many biological theorists do, and this makes it hard. But what I want to do is say, where there's a will, there's a way, and this is what's so great about science. Science has this great capacity for creativity, inventiveness. If you think really hard, there is often a way to do just a beautiful manipulation of something, right, that can lead to insights, but we have to aim high and be ambitious and think hard. And I was lucky enough to have seen the blue-eyed, brown-eyed Jane Elliott film in graduate school that made me say, oh my gosh, right? Maybe I can do some manipulations in the world in a small context that will allow me to draw some causal insights. Then I went to graduate school into courses in social psychology largely and read the work of Alpert and Tajfel, the Robbers Cave study, again, particularly influential in thinking there would be a way in social science to do some manipulations. And what I did is then 25 years of what I call my shirt studies. And what I did for 25 years is take children, briefly, who came to summer school, and I said I'm going to use a novel social category they have never heard of as a proxy for gender, right? Basically as a proxy to understand the mechanisms of social categorization and how you build a stereotype. And the beauty of this is they're going to come to school and I'm going to put them in a novel group, reds or blues. In this case, this year they were blue and yellow, and they have never heard of these groups. They've never seen a television show. They've never had a parent say, I hate yellow people. They've never, right? I'm starting with a clean state, and now I can very carefully and systematically do a manipulation to try to detect a change in children's attitudes. So I now have a history of these t-shirt studies. And I wanted to just give you the best way to get a sense of them, I think, is from the slides of the pictures. So for example, here's kids, they come to school, they're in their shirts. The teachers sometimes let them decorate them a little bit by giving them buttons for good behavior or writing their name on it. And then look at this difference from the same year. That's one classroom, this is another classroom. Can you tell what the manipulation was? These kids are sorted by, right? The teacher has obviously said yellows line up at the door. Now blues line up at the door, right? So I'm just giving you some examples of some kinds of manipulations you could do to say, would it make a difference in the environment, for example, if the teacher did something differently, mentioned the group or not? Here's another example from another year in which they're red and yellow, red and green, and you can see they're working on some spatial skills lessons, and they're obviously the teacher has segregated them, or they've segregated themselves. You wouldn't know from the picture. Here you have another room, another year. Can you tell what's going on here? What I've manipulated? There's only one red kid. There's actually two. We made children minorities. Kids came to school, their entire classroom is blue except two kids who were red, or in other cases the entire class was red and only two kids were blue. We did a series of studies on minority status, so we did this 3 different times in 3 different studies to ask the question, does it make a difference if you're 50-50 in your room, such as gender, or if there's a statistical minority in the room, as in the case, for example, which is often true with race or ethnicity. So we can manipulate that. We can also manipulate some environmental context. So in one year, kids come in their classrooms already decorated on the first day with posters that they are told, oh, those are posters from last year's summer school, right? We don't know those kids, we weren't here, but that was last year's school. So, and here you can tell what have we done. We have linked math ability to being read, right? And in these classrooms, for simplicity, we started by just linking one group to everything good. Math, reading, spelling, good behavior, and the other group got stigmatized as not good. And for ethics reasons, we couldn't do very much to convey the bad things. They let us put up one poster with kids who got disciplined for bad behavior, right? We could put all the blues up there for bad behavior, but that was what we could do. And one more just to show how it can be tied to adult roles. So in one study, we wanted to link it to more than just kids. So in a year where they're yellow and blue, we link it to school staff. So this is the school staff. Here are the principal, the vice principal, counselor, the janitor, the maintenance man, and the cook. Clearly linked again to the color of the individuals. I made my husband pose to be the janitor. Okay. So I just wanted to give you a sense then of an experimental methodology and hope to inspire the young scholars in the room to think of experimental kinds of paradigms that can be used, because we really need these kinds of studies to look at how gender conditions, environments shape children's behavior. And I think it's a matter of putting our mind to thinking of some really creative ways to do that. And the SHIRT studies might be one way to get a proxy, but there's certainly others. And many of the people at Michigan do write super creative work in this way. Okay, I want to highlight 3 more truths about gender, though, going back to actual gender. Oh, that's where it's out of line. That's where it was. Here's my anthropological truth about gender. Oops. There. Gender is an important social category in every contemporary culture we know of. So that is an interesting piece of information, and I think it's something we need to keep in mind when we're struggling to understand gender. And I just love this little example where I talk about the Gathenians who do not see one another as men or women. They have no divisions of humanity into strong, weak, halves, protected, protective. One is respected and judged only as a human being. You cannot cast a Gathenian in the role of male or female. And of course, that is only from the world of science fiction. And interestingly, it's often authors who can see beyond cultural bounds to imagine worlds, right? That's what I love about the creativity of science. There's this creativity to imagining worlds that don't exist that I think sometimes scientists need as much as fiction writers need. So we should read science fiction as my recommendation. Another is not only is gender important, men have higher status in every contemporary culture than women do, right? And that is an interesting fact we have to keep in mind as well when we're trying to understand gender in the world. So big unanswered questions that I'm also hoping to inspire students to take up is, why is gender an important social category all over the world in contemporary? Is there a reason for its predominance? That is going to get to be a controversy. I often butt heads with people about why. It's certainly possible that it's innate, that we're programmed genetically to have gender be a category we attend to, that we even stereotype and have biases about. It is also possible that it is not the case. It is merely the fact that for various reasons, cultures have developed a tendency to teach gender to be an important category for children in the culture. And why do men dominate women worldwide? How did that happen and why? Interesting hypotheses. How could we test them? Are these conditions inevitable? So what could we do? What kinds of conditions would lead to a different kind of outcome? And what would gender development look like for children in a world in which these conditions weren't true? Again, that impossibility to imagine, what isn't true for us now, to think hard about possibilities that don't exist. So, but an important part about these things is the third truth, which is equally important in my view, which is the nature and magnitude of sex differences and the way in which gender is treated vary across cultures and time. So even though I've told you in every culture they pay attention to gender and males dominate, the variations are quite notable. There are strong variations across cultures. Different organizations look at, for example, the Gender Equality Index the United Nations has for different countries. You can see the US comes in 22nd in its index, so many more countries have many more much higher levels of gender equality than the US does. So there are variations in the kinds of rights and roles and resources and status and prestige that women have, from quite high to quite low. Okay, but the index in every case favors males in every country. There are also great variations across time, even within regions. I just have to put up this picture of this little Prince Philip in a pink ruffly dress to make it obvious that things change in terms of the attributes that go with gender. Pink used to be a color associated with boys, not with girls. Boys used to wear dresses, they used to wear lace and frilly outfits, etc. So clearly the content of what we associate with the genders is highly variable. And lastly, I'll show you the world record marathon running times, and the little X's that go fairly steadily across the bottom are male scores. The circles are the women's scores, and what you see is an astounding change in women's ability to do a physical feat, right, in a relatively short span of time. And the only way to explain that, right? The only way to explain that change in women, this dramatic change in their performance, their behavior, their aptitude, is environmental, right? That something in the environment has dramatically changed women's performance in that domain. So, all this means environment absolutely plays a role. We know it plays a role. There's evidence it plays a role. But we need better data about the mechanisms that produce changes in children's gender-related attitudes and behavior. So in the rest of the time, I'm going to go through some of the things we've learned about exactly how gender shapes people's outcomes and behaviors in terms of the environment. And I just want to reference, a lot of this is coming from a theory I wrote after all the years of shirt studies. And in many cases, I would do a shirt study manipulation and then try to do a gender parallel manipulation so that I could be sure that mechanism was also working in the case of gender. And what I'm going to do is draw some conclusions from those studies for you. But they're written up in this paper, and we call it developmental intergroup theory. And it is meant to be useful for explaining not only gender, but the ways in which race and attractiveness and sexual orientation and other attributes of humans become the basis for categorization and stereotyping and prejudice. So I'm going to do this part really quick because it's overwhelming, but I just want to give you the lay of the land, which is there's three big components to our explanation of how this happens. And the first one is you have to draw kids' attention to the attribute that you want them to categorize and stereotype on, or that they're going to pay attention to. You have to draw their attention to someone's whatever race or gender. And obviously, we all differ in many physical ways. Our hair color, whether our hair is curly, whether our earlobes are attached or not, whether we're right or left-handed. And we pay attention to some of those things and we totally ignore others. Right? If I asked you what are the stereotypes of right-handed people, would you ever marry someone whose earlobes are attached? You would just be like, that's just stupid, right? Because we know there are those variations, but we don't care. So the second component is that you then categorize people. There's two kinds of people, men, women, African American, or white, etc. And the last big component is then kids learn the characteristics that go with the group. You have to learn the content of the stereotype. I got men and women. Now my job as a little child is to figure out what goes with being female, what goes with being male, and what kinds of mechanisms do kids use to achieve that goal. So let's start with the beginning. What makes a kid pay attention to gender versus anything else? We argue environmental conditions. I argue there is no biological innate basis that leads kids to pay attention to gender. I argue we over-teach through multiple mechanisms children's attention to gender to ensure that every kid in the culture grows up paying attention to who's male and who's female. And we do this in a couple of ways. One is that perceptual discriminability is important. Children, and we learn this from Piagetian theory and Piagetian-based research, have a strong tendency to pay attention to what they can see. So they are likely to develop stereotypes about things like race and gender and weight and attractiveness, but not about things they can't see, such as political affiliation. So even in this world, if you ask a 7-year-old, what are Democrats like? Tell me about Democrats, they're dumbfounded. They can't tell you. Even in this election era, when we've just done this, they don't know anything about what a Democrat is like. Okay? So and that's because you can't see it. You can ask them about, well, what are Protestants like? Right? But they can tell you about the characteristics they can see. So being able to see an attribute is a risk factor, right? It's a risk to have a perceptually salient trait that it will become a basis of stereotyping and prejudice. And I want to quickly point out why I argue this is an environmental mechanism instead of an organismic constraint purely, is that when you actually look at babies and lots of people, you can't tell their gender from purely biological cues. So you cannot peg these babies' gender, but you can if the baby's dressed like this, which as a culture we do, right? This is what's shocking. We have gone way, way overboard in making sure. We, in fact, for decades made mandatory gender-differentiated dress. Right? And the ACLU is currently suing a public school in the United States for forcing girls to wear skirts as their uniform. Right? In many places, we still insist, and any boy who tries to wear a dress to school can quickly tell you about how strongly these norms are enforced about looking. And here I'd just like to make the point of, you can tell who's male and who's female in the top picture even with their heads cut off. That is how easy dress cues make it. The bottom picture, it is very hard to discriminate who's male from who's female because they have the same haircuts and they have the same outfits, and in fact all of those people are women. There aren't men in the picture. Kids' gender is very hard to pick out for both adults and children. When you give kids bowl haircuts and gender-neutral clothing, adults have trouble picking out their gender, though they're just a little above chance. Children are at chance. Children cannot tell each other's genders without cues. And when you look at how segregated play is in childhood, this is astounding because they're using the markers, right? The hairstyle, the clothes, to tell who's male and female. And I always make a joke, that's me. So, yes, but we don't even leave it at clothes. We insist that things like cosmetics help, right, determine gender. Men do not wear bright red lipstick, ever, right? So we can help very clearly and easily mark gender with cosmetics. Then we do things like shaving to further differentiate males and females, because when women don't shave their legs look a lot like male legs, right? And then even cosmetic surgery. So since 2006, for the last 10 years, the most common cosmetic surgical procedure in the United States is breast augmentation. Right? They are surgeries that increase the differentiation physically between males and females. The fastest growing lately plastic cosmetic surgery is actually male breast reduction. As men have gotten heavier, they are more, right? Men get breasts. But in our culture, that is unacceptable. So they are now doing dramatically increasing numbers of male breast reduction. So we resort to surgical interventions, right, to make sure that our bodies don't look like one another. So I call that an environmental, this perceptual discriminant attribute, and recommend that we cease to do that. If we want gender to be less of an important socially salient category, we should reduce those cues. Okay, other important cues we've learned about include the implicit use, or I refer to most people, the best example of this is segregation, the most easy to understand. And that is when the environment sorts the people by the social category, sorts people by gender, without ever saying they did it or labeling it or acknowledging it. You just walk into a room and like the people look this way over here and women are over here, men are over here. We know that causes children to attend to the attribute. They notice and say, oh look, the people over here are all this way, the people over here, that must be important. That is enough to trigger then this classification and thinking that the attribute is important. So if, for example, I walked in and every time, all of the people who were blonde sat in one area, right? They ate together at lunch all the time. Blonde people had their own schools or neighborhoods. We would notice and think that blonde versus brunette is a major dimension. Kids live in this world, so what we do know is our world is highly segregated in a way that is not labeled and lined up. But when kids look at the world, for example, here's the percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs and administrative assistants. Kids walk into a world and notice, oh, the men are over here, right? The men are on the TV playing football, not the women. Oh, here's the women. They're on the sidelines cheering for them in skimpy outfits, right? That does not get lost on children, that kind of segregation. If you had a few women on the field and a few men in skimpy outfits cheerleading, they would not notice, right? Gender would not become that kind of a category. So social segregation plays an important role. And kids see this in lots of ways. I just put up this because we thought this might change and then it didn't. So we yet have another case in which now we're doing some studies of the election. Every kid in America is going to notice. Like every kid is going to know, no, the presidents are all men. That's something only men do. Hillary tried to be and she can't. She wasn't able to. It's men. So children detect this kind of sorting, and that is a basis. And in the case of race, I argue like the racial segregation in America is one of the most pressing problems, I argue, for preventing racial stereotyping and prejudice and social justice in the United States, because segregation is a major mechanism to produce stereotyping and prejudice. So the last one I want to mention is this explicit labeling and use, and this is when the person, the authority figure, just straight up labels the segregation and says, boys over here, girls over here, right? They use the words to sort, and you can tell that that's what's going on. It is the case that you see this when bathrooms, right? It's just the pure labeling. Women go over here to pee, men go over here to pee. You are going to see, right, big legal issues over where transgender people, go to the bathroom now coming up, probably all the way to the Supreme Court, I would guess, over this issue. And you certainly saw this historically with race. We now know that just that labeling and use plays an important role. When you label the social category, so you say, good morning boys and girls line up and boys line up and let's say boy, girl, that plays a causal role. We know from experimental studies in stereotyping, we know this from the novel group studies, we know this from studies of gender. Here's one that's not mine, but is my mentor's, that looked at preschool children, and again, just went into classes, randomly assigned students to kinds of behaviors in their classroom, so their teachers either ignored gender, never said boy, girl, girls line up, boys line up, never labeled the words male, female, and other ones in which the teachers were asked to do that a lot. Say, good morning, boys and girls, and here's a girl cubby and a boy cubby, let's sit boy, girl, etc. And I did want to show you, some bar of data. And so here, the low salience are the classrooms that don't do it. High salience is they're pointing out gender, so making it a salient social category from pre to post test. And what you see is this number of egalitarian responses that starts out about here and drops. What you see is increases in stereotyping, drops in egalitarian views, and this is egalitarian views of occupations, which no one ever talked about in the room, right? This is kids who decide, oh, gender's really important. You're labeling my gender all the time. The genders must do different things. Who spontaneously now say, only men can be firefighters. Only men can do that. Only women should be nurses, even though no one told them that, right? The teachers never said only boys can be firefighters or only girls can be nurses. The children are drawing this conclusion themselves from the importance of gender in the world. Right? So these are powerful effects. And here's a more depressing slide. This is 6 months later. The school has ended the practice because that is a negative thing to do. They're like, whoa, wow, this is bad. We're going to quit that. We're not going to talk about gender. And 6 months later, you still see these depressed levels of egalitarian responding in children whose teachers in the past, right, had made gender a salient category. And this really explains my coming to adopt gender-neutral pronouns for myself. So I now argue I want to be called Z in here, and it comes out of a political stance and commitment to political activism that says I personally don't feel myself to be genderqueer or non-gendered, but I now really believe the scientific evidence suggests that the language has to quit labeling gender in order to reduce its stereotyping and prejudice. I think a lot of Americans would still like to believe in separate but equal. The idea that with social categories, including gender, you can have two groups. You can have men and you can have women and say they're just two groups and they're different, but they're equal. Can't we just say they're different but they're both good and wonderful? And the problem is, I think that that doesn't fit well with human psychological functioning. The minimal group studies, the long history of research suggests that when people find out there are two groups of people, essentialist thought contributes to them thinking they're not the same. It's not random. If you have two categories of people, it's because they really are inherently, fundamentally, importantly different, not trivially different in trivial ways. And further, my group is better than yours. What follows automatically, I think, are affective judgments about who's better, making separate but equal incredibly hard to achieve for any social category. And so this presents our problem, right? That we have wanted to hang on to gender as two groups. They're biological, they're natural, at the same time say, can't we just get rid of stereotyping and prejudice another way? And I'm not convinced that's possible. I just wanted to point out here, in the time left, I want to shift quickly to some new areas of research, some new ways we're exploring the roles of groups and this sorting. It finally occurred to us that segregation was not the only kind of implicit use. Heterosexual pairing is also a form of implicit use, right? So to the extent it's just like if you say you're going to sit boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, you're not segregating, but you're saying your gender is important because it's going to determine where you sit, right? Like, why should my chair determine, right? My vagina determine I sit there. But the other kind of sorting kids learn is this heterosexual romantic pairing, right? It has to be a male and a female, female. And it also occurred to us that we teach children this really early, like by the time they're 3, there's this, and we actually intentionally teach them this with movie after movie that teaches them what romantic love is and that it always goes between a male and a female. And we began to think that this is also a mechanism, right? So you don't label it, but if you see that it always has to be this pairing. So we started some lines of research to children to say, do children understand romance and romantic love? Are they detecting this pairing, right? Because you might think you're only 3, you're kind of an idiot, you don't understand, you don't understand like friendship from kissy love. Or maybe you just don't pay attention to the people, right? Oh, there's kissing and I don't like kissing, you might say, or something, but I'm not really paying attention to the gender. So we did some studies. We are presenting different ads to students, and we tell them it's a study of advertising, and we show them, for example, these heterosexual pairs, and we ask a series of questions, including, are these people in love? Are these people married or getting married? Are these people in the same family? How? What is their familial relationship? Or are these people friends with each other? And what you see, this is the percent correct for these people are in love and getting married. And this is children from age 5 to about 8. And this means every 5-year-old, and we maybe have 75 of them in our study, so we now have a pretty big sample, close to 300 kids. They get this right all the time. We have taught very young children, right, how this is different from pairs that are friends, and they don't say that. And then we show them this image and ask, how do these people know each other? And now they say they are sisters. So 27% of our sample gets that right. And then thank God for Target, because we were able to show this ad, and we ask, how do these people know each other, right? Are they in love? Are they getting married or married? Are they in the same family? Are they friends? 33% of children get them right. Most children do not. And again, the pose is highly similar, right? So we've got the holding hands, the foreheads touching, which we learned conveys love, not lust, but in the moony eye love. And what you see is kids saying things like, these are 2 lawyers and they work together. This is my favorite. Those are 2 boys getting married and their wives aren't in the picture. Create a solution to that problem. study the role then of this kind of detection and what it does to their gender attitudes, right? I don't think this is harmless and just about sexual orientation. I think this is teaching children things about gender and what it means and is leading to stereotyping, rather than just about sexual orientation, because these kids at 5 don't know much about sex, right? This is doing other things to their gender. And lastly, I want to mention, well, and maybe not a couple minutes, I have been studying how the content of children's gender attitudes might be changing over time. So the content that kids build once you think gender is important, that should stay stable under conditions in which gender is labeled and people are sorted. But the links that they draw between gender and attributes might change as cultures change. And in the 50s, this was the kind of ideal image of women. So the attributes that went with femininity are things, you know, domesticity, being good at cooking. And I think they've changed a little. This is an image directed right at children. But these are also images directed right at children, the Monster High dolls. These are underwear, thong underwear, sold to children under 10. And this is a shirt, who needs brains when you have these, also marketed to the tweens, the pre-tween groups. And what you might detect those things have in common is a more sexualized, image of women. And we started to hypothesize that when children look around and say, okay, I'm a girl, what goes with being a girl? What are girls like? How do I build my links between girls and attributes? Being sexually attractive might be increasingly one of the attributes children are detecting. Again, especially in a world in which we think they are understanding heterosexual romance. Right? Many mothers claim this isn't true. So I have mothers who girls will show up in these skimpy outfits, you know, midriffs with things, sparkles across the breasts, and the kid is 6. And the mother will say, she has no idea what this is about. She just thinks it's cute. She has no idea it's linked to the male gaze or attraction or whatever. And I just want to empirically test that, right? So this is what we need more work to understand. Do they know what that is? Is it the link? Do we make assumptions that it's innocent? And I'm increasingly suspicious that it's linked to their knowledge of heterosexual romance. Important questions. And I just love this paper by Cho and Knowles about I'm like you and you're like me, social projection and social stereotyping both help explain self-other correspondence. The idea that we need to know more about once you build this stereotype about what the group is like, how you start to see yourself and how you see going both directions. How I am like my group, how I want to be like my group, how I assume my group is like me and might work to make my group like me. This idea that you have directional causal arrows both ways between self-influences me, or self-influences my view of the group and the group influences my view of me. We don't have nearly enough good experimental data on that question of how those things happen. But in the case of sexualization, I just want to highlight that as one of the things I'm interested in. So in a paper on the internalizing, I call it, of that notion that the ideal feminine person is highly sexually attractive to males, we wanted to look at that process of, do some girls internalize that and not, and how and why, and then how does it shape self-behavior, shape self-perceptions. And in just these preliminary studies, and they need to be replicated, and we need more work really badly in this area, suggested that girls who do internalize that view that I need to be sexually attractive because that's what I endorse as the model of what women are supposed to be like, show lower grades in school and invest fewer resources in kind of competency building skills as opposed to appearance-related skills, than girls who don't endorse that ideal, right? Who might say, I know that there are women in the culture who do that, but I don't personally endorse that stereotype or apply it to myself. So we need to know more about those things. So here's the last one, and I just want to tell you my latest shirt study. So the latest shirt study addresses the question of social groups are so interesting because they vary, gender and race and these different kinds. And I'm interested in trying to identify the ways that they differ and how that might play a role in shaping. So what mechanism does that difference afford? And one difference is whether the group is transparent in its existence or opaque in its existence or use. So sometimes the purpose and function of a given group is clear and sometimes it's not clear. And an example is like this school for the visually blind and impaired. So individuals with some disabilities, right, they're a social group, the blind, and they might have their own school for the blind. And I would argue that seems more transparent for its purpose, for example, than some other groups, because a kid might say, well, they can't see, so they need these certain constraints. Other kinds of kids might be really opaque, other kinds of social categories. So the St. Stephen's Episcopal School. The Episcopal kids have their own school, and you might ask, why is that? And I think your average kid would say, I have no idea, right? Okay, I don't know what Episcopal is, and I don't know why they would need their own school to be Episcopal, right? And I think probably gender is somewhere in the middle. So gender is somewhat of a mystery, right? If you have the Enricher School for Women Leaders, I can tell you the school doesn't tell the kids why there has to be a same, right? So it's a little bit of a mystery why there's men and women, and kids have to engage in this constructive process of figuring out why there's the difference. So we wanted to use the novel groups to test this hypothesis. That children who are members of opaque groups will show higher levels of in-group biased attitudes and behavior, stereotyping, etc., than children in transparent groups. And again, I got to attribute Sandra Bent with the idea, who argued that in the case of gender, what we should tell kids is that gender means only one thing. We should strip away the attributes linked to gender to just genitalia. So she argued we should just tell girls what's gender. Girls have a vagina, boys have a penis. It's the only difference there is between them. Right? And now the argument she makes is it'll reduce stereotyping. They won't say girls should be nurses and boys should be surgeons, because you'd say, how does having a vagina help you be a nurse, right? Strip away those other things to make it. That can be problematic, and no one's tested that hypothesis, right? It's a fascinating hypothesis, totally untested. But, so the argument is to test this with groups. If I could put kids in a novel group they've never heard of, and I've told kids this narrow, simple, clear, right, definition of the group and why it exists, and the other kids have the group but they don't know why and have to build, I'm going to argue they're going to build a bigger set of stereotypic attributes, because they're going to walk around the world saying, she keeps saying I'm yellow, she keeps saying yellow kids line up, right? The teacher says yellow, blue, yellow, blue. Yellow must mean something, I don't know what, I better look around and figure it out. And they might draw more links. So we used the groups. Here's what we did. We got 72 kids in this study from 6 to 12. They're in their 8-week summer program. They come to class. They get assigned. We've got kids in opaque 2 conditions. They're in shirts, randomly assigned to be red or green. And we're going to manipulate this transparency or opacity by giving them some spatial skills tests. So they arrive at school, first day of school. They take a battery of academic tests, including spatial skills tests. They've not heard of these, so these are novel tests, but they're pretty fun. They like them. This involves one where you have to say what the little figure's looking at and see which one it is. And now we've got the transparent kitchen, and kids are told that their performance on the spatial test was the basis of their group membership. And the other kids are told nothing about the basis of why they're green or red. So it's a mystery, it's opaque. And just to give you an example, all the teachers say the same script. So it's at this school, each color group always has 2 groups of children, reds and greens. Each of you has been assigned to a color group. You will wear a red shirt or a green t-shirt each day. You cannot change your group or your t-shirt. Here's how I decided who is red and who is green. Remember the spatial skills exercise you completed last week? Red students have one way of working on spatial skills problems, and green students have a different way of working on the spatial skills problems. There is no best way to work on the spatial programs. They're just 2 different but equal ways, right? And we get this separate but equal, but it's constrained. We tell them it's just your spatial skills. The other condition, they're told nothing, so they also get the top part. They don't get any mention of why they're in the group. So they go, they have spatial skills lessons, and they get in their group. So we reinforce it, and every time, which is several times, 2 times a week, they get in the group, we remind them. We're saying, get in your red and green group, right? You're going to work on the spatial skills. They worked on Legos. You saw the picture, right? And they're reminded, you're in this group because you solved these problems one way, they solved them a different way. So they're told repeatedly the reason for why they're in the group. The other groups get in the group, but they're never told why. So, at the end, I thank you for listening. I on the slide, I'm going to tell you the story. I didn't need a slide. It makes no difference. Okay, we do all this work, we do 2 months of testing, we do big batteries of pre to post tests. There's no significant difference in the levels of stereotyping or peer preference. I can tell you they all get biased. The group mean is we like our own group better, the reds are better, no matter what. But there is no difference between they're told why they're red and kids who are not told why they're red. And this actually fits some of my other work, but I think one of the conclusions I'm coming to is just being in a group is incredibly powerful and does a lot of the work. When you are in a group that seems important in your environment, because adults are labeling you and talking about it and you see people sorted, it maybe really doesn't matter what the basis of that group and sorting is. You will go to extremes. You will elaborate. You will claim there are other differences, whether you are explicitly told them or not, maybe especially if you're a child. But that's a flavor of where we're going. We continue to do these studies in different places when we can get a school that'll be crazy enough to let us put all the kids in shirts and work that way. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions. I know some of you have to go, so feel free if you are out of your own time. We'll wait a minute. And the GFB area usually tries to have questions from students first.
Yeah, please.
I'm still sort of developing my question, but I'm thinking a lot about this idea that engaging in certain feminine behaviors has maybe a lot of these negative effects, but there's also a lot of critiques talking about how this devaluation is sort of like people who are high femme. So how would you address that or incorporate that into the discussion?
Yes, and what it looks like me over and over again is the outgroup is doing the devaluing, usually, right? So groups sort, label, to figure out what goes with the group, and then values what goes with the group. So if one group was likely to devalue feminine, high feminine attributes and behaviors, it would be men and not women, right? More so. And one of the kinds of responses, intervention, is to just keep insisting, no, our group is good, right? We're just as good as you, right? That's what the pressed group tends to be. No, the things we do, they're different from what you do, but they're just as good. They're just as good. And I think I've just gotten a little pessimistic about that ever working, right? The outgroup just tends not to believe that your group is just as good. And again, you can think about single-sex schools. To the extent that women just decide to go to single-sex schooling and then even if they did do well, which they don't, but if they did do well academically because it was single-sex, well, what would men think of those schools? When you look at the history of single-sex schooling, which schools were academically prestigious? The male schools or the female schools? The male schools. Right? The Harvard and the Yales were always more prestigious than the female. They still are more prestigious than the female versions. So I don't think we're ever going to get anywhere if we just keep insisting, we're just as good, we're just as good. It's that tendency when I'm in a group, we're better, that seems really powerful in humans and that we have a strong predisposition toward. So if I'm inclined to believe any kind of evolutionary argument, it is that we are totally flexible about how we categorize, right? I'm sure I could get kids to categorize on the basis of earlobes. Give me one day in a classroom and I could get kids to say, kids with their earlobes attached, that is gross. They're bad. They're not as smart as us, right? They are that flexible in response to the cues, but what I can't get them to do is say, oh, it's just different. It's totally equal. Right? They seem to be a drive, and maybe it's self-protective, right, to say our group is better and not say that, yeah, they're better, we suck, I wish I were them. Humans tend to resist that kind of thinking. So as a strategy, I'm just less optimistic that it works. And here I'll just tell you my last important thing. The groups do not have to be identical in order to eliminate the use of the group. People have said to me, look, men and women are different. There are some biological differences and you're never going to get rid of them. Therefore, you're never going to get rid of stereotyping and prejudice. So here's the coolest condition of all of my shirt studies. Kids come to school, they wear the shirts for 2 solid months every day, and at the end of those 2 months, we ask how many red kids are smart. Think about the red kids, almost, some are none. Think about the blue, yellow kids. But in those 2 months, if their teacher never mentioned the shirts, you get 0 prejudice. Okay? So in other words, I was surprised. It's not automatic. You just don't put the kids. There's some evidence that adults will. All you got to do is put adult in a shirt in a group and they like their own group better. Children don't. And we've had that as a control condition many times. And the kids at the end, if they never heard a teacher or an authority figure talk about the group, they're equal. In fact, they look surprised you ask the question. So at the end you say, think about the red kids. How many of the red kids are smart? They go, huh? Oh, I don't know, like some of them, right? Because they're like, you never mentioned this before. It would be like when I suddenly ask you, what do you think of Protestants, right? Would you marry a Protestant? How smart are Protestants? And you're like, what? What kind of question is that? We don't think about Protestants. So I don't think men and women have to be the same. In other words, you can have femininity. You can have hair bows and long hair. And I don't think that means you're automatically going to get attention to gender. You get attention to gender because adults are labeling it. We have all these nouns. What a good girl, what a good boy. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And that makes them say, oh, this hair bow is important. It's what girls do. Girls do other things, and now we're better. Right? If it's not a category, then we don't care if the difference is there. So kids just don't notice them. We've even done it when we made the groups different in the posters, and if the teachers don't, they don't notice. They're like, oh no, I didn't even really look at those posters, right? I didn't notice who was good at math, the boys or the reds or the blues. Yes?
Could you explain a little more to that point about how to not be attentive to social categories but without being race blind or gender blind, especially in a context where it might be majority, where children don't have exposure to others?
And I'm often asked, so I do the whole spiel about don't do the labeling and the sorting, and some people think that means I'm endorse a colorblind or genderblind ideology. I spent a lot of time in my talk last night talking about that is not an effective solution. And the problem is because children are all raised in a world that does this. So no child born today will totally escape seeing the world through gendered lenses because our whole language makes them, right? Invites noun labeling for gender and gender categorization and gender essentialism and the sorting. Same is true of race. So to suddenly say, me as the parent, I'm just never going to mention it, and now you won't be racist or sexist because I never mentioned the word black people, doesn't work at all. So we know from studies, some of them I've done and other people's studies, that colorblind socialization does not work to get rid of racial attitudes. Genderblind socialization won't do it either. So I argue what that means is we have to talk about race and gender, and we should only talk about social categories purposefully and meaningfully, never routinely with no explanation. So in the grocery store, if the kid says, where's this? They should never say, oh, ask that lady. Right? You've just labeled her a lady for no reason. You're not explaining why. You could say, ask that tall person, ask that adult, right? Ask the blonde. So don't label for no reason. But when your child notices, because they will, they're going to sort and then they're going to say, men are doctors, women are nurses. Common thing for the kid to conclude from looking at the world and building character. Then you have to say, oh, you've noticed that. Let's think about that and talk about that. Why do you think that happens, right? Do you think there's something in girls that makes them nurses? And that is a place to have a conversation about what gender means and doesn't mean? No, gender isn't linked to occupations. In fact, there are men who are nurses, and you might get one out and say, see, men can be nurses. Here's a man, he's a nurse. Here's a woman. They're the same. They're nurses. They're different genders. And then talk about discrimination and prejudice. So that's when I go to time to introduce a conversation about gender and stereotyping, and the idea that maybe women couldn't be doctors, and then that was totally true. You can tell your child women were banned from medical school, which is totally true, all the way right up until, if you've heard Lynn Libben talk at SRCD, all the way up in the 50s and 60s, they had quotas that were very small for women. So you can tell a child, why aren't women doctors? Well, it doesn't have anything to do with being female, with having a vagina or a uterus, right? Totally irrelevant to doctoring business. It has to do with this stereotyping and prejudice, the constraints that were unfair and were wrong, and happily they're gone now, and more women become doctors every day. So you can be a doctor, women can be a doctor, etc. So have those conversations. Do not be gender blind or race blind, right? But don't meaningless, right? Don't use it when there's no reason. And think about adopting gender-neutral language. More people are going to have to do it, as I think we need in our language a way to refer to people. Right? We're just straight up going to have more people who aren't male or female. So we are going to have to accommodate it.
I don't know if you looked at this, but for the single-sex schooling, in all boys schools, what reasons do boys give for wanting to be in an all boys school?
Number one, my parents forced me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it is a number one response. When we ask all of the kids in the single-sex school, why are you here, they say, my parents wanted this for me. They are wildly unpopular with children. So when asked that the communities want these, they usually do not want these. Even only a small minority of parents want them, but there is a small minority that want them. And the research, when you compare girls' schools and boys' schools, it is only the girls' schools that ever have positive outcomes. I mean, overall, boys' schooling does not look good. They seem not to like it as well. It seems a harsher place. The outcomes are never as good. Often it resorts to looking a little like military schools, and there's some confounds, like some boys might, that selection characteristic are sent there because they have issues that have made their parents sent them to a military type kind of school. So yeah, not good. And the problem is, and I get lots of feminists who say, I love schools for girls. I want that. In fact, at the University of Texas, the Women in Gender Studies program became an official partner with the Ann Richards School for Young Women Leaders. They openly said, we will not partner with the male school. We don't like only boys schools. But if you create all girls schools, what are you going to get? Schools in which the other girls are wildly outnumbered. Right? Oh, that's nice of you, right? You don't like boys and you want to get away from them, but you're going to leave those girls in a room. And you're creating worlds in which they're more likely to be all boys because you're siphoning off the girls. But and I find that to be somewhat of a problematic response in terms of the hypocrisy of saying, I think we should be able to exclude you, but I don't think you should be able to exclude us. So yeah, the Women's and Gender Studies Department became an official partner for a few years.
I really enjoyed your talk, and there are several parts during the talk where you paralleled some of the research you're doing on gender to apply to like other social groups. But I was just wondering, in your own thinking about your research and in your theoretical framework, are there aspects that you think are specific to gender that don't apply to these other groups?
Yes, so each group has its unique environmental context and attributes. So one I mentioned is gender tends to be 50-50 in a situation. Not all, right? Because we also have places that are segregated. Where with race being African Americans, 13% of the population, they're more likely to be a statistical minority. And the argument is, does that do something special, right? Is that a unique mechanism then that is happening for race that is not happening for gender? Which we then tried to test with the shared studies, right? By making kids minorities and seeing if something special happens. And it does, by the way. Being really outnumbered has its unique psychological consequences, absolutely, that aren't there for gender when they're not those kinds of minorities in a room typically. So I'm interested in comparing and arguing what's unique. And in the other direction, for example, with gender, kids go to school and hear, good morning, boys and girls. They do not go to school and hear, good morning, whites and Latinos. Let's have the blacks get their pencils. And people laugh. That actually is against federal law. Right? Why we don't hear it? It is very clearly against federal law in the United States. You can go to federal prison if you walked into a classroom in first grade and did that. Okay, so that's a real difference. We do it with gender, we don't do it with race. So then we try to understand that mechanism and what's it doing, if you label it or not, with the color group methodology, right? And we argue it has this unique circumstance. And again, race, you're more likely to see the segregation, right? If you look at families, families usually have males and females in them. They usually don't have whites and blacks in them, right? So race and gender are different because of the segregation degree. That you can go into a neighborhood in Austin that is entirely African American. You cannot go to a neighborhood in Austin that is entirely female. And again, so we try to test that. What role does that have? So I am not an advocate of saying all the social groups are alike. They're totally not. But what we need is a lens that asks very critically, what is unique about the environmental characteristics, right? The size of the group, the status of the group, how much power the group has. We don't know enough about any of those things. Like, I would love to have the yellow group have all the power in the classroom and the yellow kids not have power and see what that does, right? How do kids detect power and use it and what does it do? Those are things I think they get ethically hard to do, right? I've done some ethically hard things to do, but I haven't done that one. But that's so I like people to think about more than one group. I think I have learned so much about gender by studying race. I have learned a lot about race from studying sexual orientation. Right? I've done studies with weight bias. And I have a colleague, Judy Langlois, who does attractiveness bias, and I read all of her studies and learn so much about the biases we have toward people who are attractive over unattractive. And that has made me a richer theoretical, I think, thinker about social groups. So I advocate not being narrow, read broadly about everything in psychology, right? If you're interested in stereotyping and prejudice, read your cognitive development. All that stuff about noun labeling that I tried to ignore in graduate school turns out to be wildly important, right? Things like essentialist thought, which covered in my cognitive class, not in my social class, things like noun labels covered not in my social class, have turned out to play really powerful mechanisms in social stereotyping and prejudice. In other words, we needed all these cognitive perspectives to understand a social problem. And so we really need to be broad thinkers, right? And graduate school is the awesome time to go to all the talks, read everything you can. Even if it doesn't seem relevant right at the moment, it is likely to be relevant right later in understanding the complexity of kids' thought in our world. Great question. Yes?
You had mentioned one of the studies that wasn't yours, where there was the 6-month lag in sort of
Lynn Libben's study.
So that made me think about shirt studies. So it sounds like some deprogramming needs to happen to counter some of the effects that you're creating. So I'm curious kind of methodologically how you feel about that.
Yeah, great question. So we always have a big debriefing in which we explain everything we've done and why we did it. Starting with a conversation of, I'm a psychologist, what's a psychologist, what's my job, here's what we were doing. And those debriefings are fabulous. The kids get to talk, the teachers are there, and the experimenter, usually I'm there, a grad student who's been involved is there. And we run the conversations and we get kids to talk about the experience. So sometimes I learn these great things from the debriefing where you're like, God, I wish that was in the study because this is a fascinating thing they just said. And we explicitly link it to other groups with the hope that they get some insight. So we say, they said, I felt bad that I was in the yellow shirt because I saw we didn't win any of the contest, right? That's a quote. I saw we didn't win anything and I felt bad. And so we say, can you think of any other group that might happen to, right? Do you know of any other group of people? They're not yellow, but they might feel bad because they don't see themselves. And some kid will always bring up gender in some way, or race in some way, or physical ability in some way, right? It must make kids feel bad if they don't see themselves winning, blah, blah, blah. So I try to use it. It's a mini intervention of hang on to the feelings you had and hope you learn something. Have I ever tested whether they do or how it affects them long term? No, I never have. What I've done is one study of debriefing effectiveness, but in a way that it's not long term and doesn't really get at what you would really want. Whether the experience is long-term meaningful. And what I've kind of argued is that they go out in the world and they don't like people in blue shirts. Probably they're not screwing up their whole life or other people's life because the kid who has on a blue shirt will have a yellow shirt on tomorrow or a green shirt on tomorrow, so you probably don't permanently hate him. So I've tried to be like, okay, and that's a nice thing. It allows me to do things that ethically I couldn't actually do with race or gender, right? Because I could make them worse, really. That's the gender stuff is problematic. We ask teachers to say, good morning, boys and girls, every morning. And now I know that was really bad. We've produced, right? And I should never do that again, and I haven't done it since I did it in 1995. But you could never do that with race, right? It'd be unethical, but I can get away with doing it with color groups because other people agree with me, probably they're not having long-term, right, psychological consequences of not liking yellow people. But it'd be even better if they learned something, and I should go back. But they come to summer school and then they scatter. They go to 27 different school districts on average at this summer school, and the work to get them back is more than I can manage. A great question.
So we're out of time. I'm sorry.
But come ask me, because I'll stand here as long as they'll let me.
Okay, well, thanks so much, and let's give... So some people are taking your lunch, right? Okay. And you have to do this with the customer trip and a good trip. You'll learn to hustle. Hang around now. You don't know. Thank you so much. This is so good to do. Yeah, and I'll stay in touch with them. I'm going to read your paper and we'll work together. So, yeah. You can't wait. Here. Here's one.
great talk. I saw you at this year with the interesting that students who were assigned to red or green t-shirts that we have called teachers in the different sessions. I wonder if
Good, thank you. I'm just wondering if this is still going. And if I no?
if that would find kids to
Much fancier than you have to tell. Right, so boring and not.
Hey, Will, do you remember, this is the same, they might think, remember the button to turn it off?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Will was recording.